Great. I'm just giving it a moment, but I can see everybody adding. So good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today for this session. It's really nice to see so many of you online. I saw quite a few familiar names on the events list, so really nice to see you again. And for those of you who I haven't met yet, really nice to connect with you, and a very warm welcome. I'm Laura Loudon, and I oversee recruitment activity for our diploma in Organisational Leadership. But the focus of today really is to hear from Professor Sue Dopson and Dr Eleanor Murray, who I'm really pleased could join the session today. They both wear many hats here at the business school, but in relation to this programme, Sue is the academic director and been leading the programme for a good number of years. And Eleanor teaches on the programme and has a great deal of experience in resilience and leadership, which is the focus of Module 4. And she'll be talking to you a little bit more about that in the session today. So the aim of today really is to give you a bit more insight into what to expect from the programme, get a bit of a flavour for the teaching and the types of things you'll be learning about. The Q&A function is up and running, and we will be monitoring that throughout. We'll probably pause and check it at various points. So any questions that you have, please do pop those on, and we're happy to take those. And then towards the end of the session, I'll also do a quick update on a few details that are key to the programme. So I'll be talking about our delivery details, the application process and deadlines. So do hang on if you can, and hopefully that will be useful. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Sue, who will tell you a little bit more about the programme. So over to you, Sue.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm delighted to meet you virtually. So as Laura said, I'm academic director of the programme, and it's a great privilege and a great honour to do that. Indeed, it's one of the joys of my working life is to be involved in this programme. So let me say a little bit about the sort of flow of the programme, and I guess most importantly, how we've innovated and why, you know, Eleanor and I have put resilience into this programme as a key plank of Module 4. So the programme starts, and you may well know this, so apologies if I'm going over old ground, but the programme starts with really digging deep into the fundamentals of leadership, the things that we as leaders absolutely need to know about. So things like motivation, how you manage teams, how you think about culture, how you manage change. So really fundamentals, but it's explored in a very sort of thoughtful way using latest research, and also making use of the community of practice in the room. So the teaching will be presentation of ideas and thoughts, but an invitation for you to explore those ideas and thoughts in your own practice together as a community. Module 2 is then sort of switches to look at strategy, because it is our belief that leadership and strategy are two sides of the same coin. So we look at how do we shape strategy, mergers and acquisitions, you know, really dig deep about that strategic importance of leadership. And then Module 3, in a way, blends them. It talks about strategic leadership, and that really focuses more on implementation. What are the challenges of getting good ideas and good practices into practice and having an impact on the organisation as well? So let me come to sort of the Module 4 and just give you an honest flavour of where that change came from. It wasn't a radical change. Module 4 used to be about managing change, which of course, you know, resilience is part of. But it was really interesting. So, you know, Eleanor and I and colleagues were thinking about what we're noticing about how leadership work is changing. And it's quite clear that the idea about leaders being heroes is gone. And what we're now dealing with is leadership work that is largely around managing emotions, ambiguity, uncertainty, and people, which requires very different leadership skills. It requires the ability to ask great questions. It requires the ability to convene conversations that wouldn't normally happen. And ironically, we're having these conversations before the pandemic. So we were planning to do this, Eleanor, before the pandemic. And then, of course, we've all been through what we've been through in the last 18 months, which has shown us that the notion of thinking about how do you build an organisation that is agile and resilient is even more important. How do you build people? How do you help people lead and be more resilient, given the uncertainty that we have experienced? We've already experienced, but particularly experienced in the last 18 months is very important. So for me, this module really is focusing on thinking much more about you as a leader and what you can do for your organisation to build resilience. And in that, we really begin to get you to think about how organisations have changed. They're not machines anymore. We experience them as conversations. We experience them as being irrational. We know that we're interdependent. We know that we are accountable, but we're not in control. We know that we don't just lead with just talking to people, but we can lead through shifting context so that energy is released. So in that sense, that kind of thinking about what do leaders need to get better at, given the reality of the leadership challenges that we are facing and indeed have faced in the last 18 months. I think this last module, and Eleanor's going to talk a little bit about some of the things that she does on it, is really critical. But I hope you can see how it builds on the three modules, but the focus is on very much building your resilience, challenging you to think about what kind of leader you want to be, what kind of impact you want, what kind of responsible leadership do you want to exercise, but also at the organisational level. What kind of organisational context do you want to shape so that you're proud to lead and it's going to make an impact in the fields that you've chosen to. So that really is a sort of history of the change. So I hope that's helpful. Happy to take any questions on that. But that really honestly is where the thinking and the shift came. And I think it's fair to say that the last 18 months, we have experiences now collectively which we can draw upon and interrogate as part of that module, which I think will make this theme even more relevant. So Laura, that's all I want to say about that. I'm happy to take questions, but maybe over to Eleanor.
Thank you, Sue. I think that was great and very, really useful to hear more about the programme, and sets the scene very nicely to lead into Eleanor. So doesn't look like we have any questions at the moment, but please feel free to post these later. We will pause after Eleanor's session. So any questions for Sue, do pop those online. But I'll hand over to you, Eleanor.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. It's great to meet you. So a lot of my work has been focusing on resilience particularly in the healthcare sector and the banking sector, and doing in-depth research to really understand what we mean by building resilience. How do you build resilience personally as an individual leader, and then how do you build resilience as a whole organisation? And there tends to be a misnomer that individual leadership is what resilience is all about. But in fact, you could have a number of resilient individuals in an organisation, but that wouldn't necessarily make the whole organisation resilient. And that's one of the tensions that we explore on this programme. So just a little introduction, by way of an introduction, is to really think about what do we mean by leadership resilience. So how do we actually understand ourselves as leaders in terms of our own resilience? And that might be at a personal level. What do we mean by our own personal resilience? And professionally, what does it mean to be a resilient leader in work? And we think about it from a psychological perspective. So that's how do you respond to adversity? And how can you build on that so that when you encounter adversity, how can you strengthen your own resilience as you go through really challenging and difficult situations? And we encourage leaders to really reflect on that in terms of how they cope with adversity. And we use internationally validated tools to help them assess their own resilience and to think about their own experiences and what's led to them building their resilience through various different challenges that they've encountered. And then we also look at organisational resilience, and we explore where you focus your attention in the business. So as a leader, when you're working in an organisation, where do you focus your attention, and what does that mean for building organisational resilience throughout an organisation? And we think about it from looking at the strategic elements of an organisation, the social elements of an organisation. And we also look beyond the organisation at the systems element. So where does your organisation sit in an ecosystem of other organisations to maybe dealing with similar challenges and opportunities? So one of the questions we ask you is, how resilient are you? We get you to really think about that and think about your own resilience in relation to your leadership and how you approach leadership. And we we want you also to very much relate your resilience to your own context. And one of the joys really of this programme is that we have participants coming from very different backgrounds, very different contexts. And so there's a lot of rich discussions and debate from participants discussing what their contexts look like, what's helped them become resilient, what adversity they've faced, and how they've coped with that in terms of both being a manager and a leader. And I think this quote particularly rings true, which is following true adversity, and this is a sort of gut-wrenching, hole in your heart, sleepless nights kind of, which I'm sure some of you as leaders have coped with and felt during the COVID pandemic. There's no bouncing back, there's only bouncing forward. And from my own research, one of the concepts that I sort of bring to the study of resilience is there's a tendency for people to talk about the fact that when you are resilient, you bounce back to where you were. But I take a approach that's drawn from positive psychology, which is very much about you can only really bounce forward because you're taking on board the learning, the reflection that you're taking from dealing with adversity. And that's what actually strengthens your resilience, is being able to learn from and reflect on the way you cope with difficult situations and the way you take advantage of opportunities. So then the next area we look at, so that's a little bit about leadership resilience and how we approach it. So we very much get you to have a really reflective look at yourself and the approach you've taken to leadership in the past and how you might approach it going forward, and how you can strengthen and build on your existing resilience on the basis that we see resilience very much as a process and not an outcome. So that's another sort of conceptual element of the course, is that resilience is very much an ongoing process because you're continually responding to adversity as you go through life, both personally and professionally. It's not just something that you try to achieve and then that's the end of it. And from an organisational perspective, I'll give you some insights into the way we approach resilience from an organisational perspective and how to think about building resilience from that aspect. So when you're thinking about how resilient is your organisation, one way of understanding it, and this is the way I understand resilience based on my research, is that it's about the capacities and capabilities of an organisation that enable it to recalibrate in response to varied conditions. And it's looking to not just sustain its performance, going back to the concept of bouncing back. We're not looking to just sustain its performance or just hang in there surviving. We're looking to see how an organisation can learn from adversity to really improve its performance. And I've used the word recalibrate because I think the concept of resilience for me is always about continual recalibration. When you look at organisations that maintain and grow resilience, they're continually recalibrating to the external conditions and to the situation they're finding themselves in internally. And it's an ongoing process of review, reflection, learning, improvement. So I thought today I'd just spend a little bit of time thinking about what we mean by varied conditions, because this is really an underpinning of resilience. It's very much about how do you respond either as an individual to adversity in your life or as an organisation to the sort of conditions that are bearing around you. How do you respond to and deal with that in a positive way? And I think in the current climate, as I'm sure you're all experiencing as leaders yourself, we're facing a huge amount of volatility in the world globally. Some of this coming from geopolitical issues, populist leaders. We've seen with COVID some of the challenges that there have been between a sort of scientific narrative and a populist narrative in terms of how we deal with COVID as an outbreak, and what that means for how effectively and quickly countries are able to overcome COVID and to deal with it. And it's very much about volatility, or sometimes we call it tuna, and call it turbulent, uncertain, novel and ambiguous. But it's very much about the magnitude and the dynamics of change. And one example of this would be climate change. What we're seeing with climate change, with all the floods and the fires and things connected with climate change and global warming is that the magnitude and dynamics of change are becoming ever more extreme. And so as a leader, that's beginning to affect businesses and the way they operate, both in terms of a drive towards sustainability and also thinking about how it affects aspects of their business like supply chains and business continuity, because climate change is beginning to have a big impact on that. So how can leaders think about anticipating what might be coming towards them rather than just reacting to it? And that's something in resilience we spend a lot of time thinking about. How can you get on the front foot and be anticipatory rather than being on the back foot and being reactive? We also think about uncertainty, and again, this is an issue with issues like Brexit and COVID, is the lack of predictability. It's increasingly hard to think about strategy from a longer term basis because we're so busy reacting to and responding to things that we hadn't predicted in the present. So again, it's about thinking more strategically. How do we anticipate and be curious about what's coming towards us? What are the emerging issues that we should be taking account of as a leader? Rather than just being very narrowly tunnel visioned and focusing on the present, how can we step back and take a longer term perspective looking ahead? And apologies for the noise, there's some building work outside. We then look at issues around complexity, and we start to think about what makes the current situation complex, and quite often it can be relating to confounding issues. And we also think about ambiguity as well. So we often find that there's often people take mixed meanings from conditions. This can be because people come at issues from different perspectives, and so one person's perspective may be different from another person's, and so we find there's mixed meanings in conditions. And often you see that with the way countries approach issues of geopolitics. There can be very mixed meanings in the way one country interprets another country's trade issues or issues of demographics, for example. They might approach them very differently. So what we see as a leader is we look in terms of leadership and organisational resilience in terms of how can you actually respond to what might be potential vulnerabilities created by this mishmash of different issues, and how can you actually seize opportunities. And resilience is very much about being anticipating potential vulnerabilities, but also being open to new opportunities. And we've seen with COVID that some businesses have really managed to pivot and start to think differently about how they manage their businesses, what opportunities they can take advantage of, opportunities of technology, it might be home working, the way they tackle the future of work, different ways of operating that mean that there might be potential profit margins in different areas. And those businesses that have been agile and been able to pivot rapidly have been the ones that have profited from the pandemic. So I think hopefully that provides some insight into the way we start thinking about conditions, and those businesses and organisations that can not just cope and survive with these different challenges, but can actually anticipate and have some level of planning and curiosity about them, are those that can sort of start to thrive in this, what we call a VUCA environment. So one thing we do throughout this programme is to really encourage you to think about some of these concepts and then what they mean for your own practice, as Sue was saying, and what do they mean for the different contexts that you find yourself in as leaders. So some of the sort of discussion points that we might think about in our sessions, in our modules, are what sort of personal changes can you make to increase your leadership resilience, and we'll share with you strategies that you could consider adopting, get you to think about what they mean for you in your own context. Another question I've recently asked a class is, do you lead or manage in a crisis? So when you're faced with some adversity and some of these crisis conditions we've seen recently, do you focus downwards in a very specialised way, in a technical way on management, or can you lift yourself above the sort of hubris of the crisis and think more strategically about how you lead effectively? And sometimes it's about balancing those two elements. You need to do both and, which is what we call the sort of paradox of leadership, being able to do both and at the same time. And another question is, how can you create an environment that builds resilience in whatever teams you're working in? So you might be working on a board, or you might be working in sort of project teams. So what can you do differently to create an environment that builds resilience? And we'll again share tools and strategies with you that enable you to think, what can you take from this and how can you apply it in your own context? So hopefully that gives you some flavour of how we teach, and the way we teach, hopefully in a very interactive way, encouraging participants to really think about their own context, their own experience. And I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Eleanor. I think you had to be resilient there yourself, coping with all the
Yes,
building work.
Apologies for
that
the
was
noise.
no, it's incredible. I think we're all used to. I'm just looking at some of the chat questions, and please do put some questions in. Eleanor, there's a question from Rebecca, I think. If the organisational person survives the impact, then the stronger the impact, the bigger the learning. So there's a series of conversation which you won't have picked up on, which is, when a shock hits the system, do you need different strategies for resilience dependent on how big the shock is? And I think that was the question, the trail here that was going on.
Yes, I mean, one aspect that I haven't touched on in this session is how you tackle resilience around sort of business as usual, where you're faced with a certain number of sort of disruptions maybe to the way you work. It might be a change of leadership, it might be different, impacts on your supply chain, it might be a change in the system that you're working in, and how you approach that is, to some extent, there's some differences in how you might approach that to how you might approach a major crisis, because in a major crisis there's an immediacy in terms of what you're dealing with that maybe isn't there to the same extent when you're working in a more business as usual way. So some of the suggestions I make when we're talking about business as usual is the way of embedding a resilience within your organisation through elements like a balanced scorecard or prospective meetings, whereas when you're in a crisis situation, it takes a different approach. It's not so much about embedding it in the organisation, but really building on, like Sue said, about relationships, building on some of those relationships you already have in the organisation, and building what's sometimes called in the literature swift trust, or very rapid trust building, to enable you to work rapidly with a network of people to handle what might be very unpredictable circumstances.
Okay, there's some questions in the question and answers now, which is coming in.
Yes, we've had a couple of questions, and thanks, Eleanor, for that. So the first one actually is a good one. It's asking about COVID. So the question is, has COVID impacted the class dynamics and experience for those who haven't been able to meet in person? I'm sure that you both sort of witnessed the class bonding, so it's great to hear your sort of comments.
Yeah, no, it's been very interesting because we've had 2 iterations now, haven't we, Laura, of this impact. The first one, they had module 1 all together, and so they did the Oxford experience and so forth as well, and then they were all online. And what was interesting about that was, I think, that the shock of everything meant that the group became even more bonded, actually, and they were sharing more conversations with each other because they felt they were going through a shared experience. And what I noticed was, I think that cohort and the current cohort are probably even more bonded and committed to working in between modules with each other. So both of the cohorts actually arrange things separate. I mean, I don't go to everything. I couldn't possibly go to everything, but they've arranged things such that they share their own stories. So 3 of them, for example, will just talk about their leadership journeys and what they're struggling with. And I just thought that was just incredible. So they're kind of peer or group coaching, really, in a way. So I would say that in terms of COVID, yes, it's been challenging. It's been very challenging from our end as well, just pivoting and being innovative about this kind of technology. And the last group, we've just done hybrid, haven't we? We've just done module 3 hybrid. So some people were in the room and some people were out of the room. And actually, I was worried about that because I thought, oh, goodness, will there be divisions? But actually not at all. So there's something about, well, I think the way we design it, and I'm not blowing our own trumpets here, but I think there's something about that participation in learning throughout the module that bonds people together. But frankly, it's something about the group, and particularly the class reps, I would argue, Laura. They've been marvellous. They've worked very closely with me in responding to how we need to pivot, but they've also just been so responsible in terms of building a community of learning. And maybe something I should have said, but you will learn as much from the group as you will from people like me and Eleanor doing our stuff. So I hope that answers your question. I think it was anonymous, wasn't it? If there's anything you want to come back to, or also for how do students interact with one another outside the modules? Is there any formal teaching? Yeah, so no, I mean, it's very much informal. I mean, what I have done, what we have done in response to giving back, given when we were fully online, was, I've done extra seminars, we've put on extra things like that, just to make sure that we are, as a school, facilitating learning, but they've done most of that themselves, if I'm really honest. Laura, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add. Eleanor, I think that's been my experience, but of course it's not just this course. We've got this challenge throughout a whole range of programs, but and in some ways the technology, that this method of teaching, we've learned how to do our jobs differently, and in some sense I think we've got better at facilitating learning. So whilst it's been a shock to the system, I think we've become more agile. Eleanor, I don't know if you agree with that.
I do, actually, and I think it's encouraged us to do one element of resilience, which is experimentation.
Yeah.
So it's very much, we've experimented with different approaches, we've tried out new tools, and it's encouraged a real sort of unleashing of creativity and energy around the way we teach and what pedagogical approaches we use. So I think it's been a really, in that sense, really positive experience that has really enhanced our teaching and learning.
Great. We've had an interesting question asking here. I'm not sure if you can say it. How much do you believe the transition that you've seen in terms of organisations becoming less machines and more conversations as a consequence of the increasing expectations of the role of work in life? Just an increased awareness that they were never machines.
Yeah, I think probably both is true.
Yes, I think it's a lovely question, isn't it?
It is a lovely question, but I think both is true. And but what I think is very interesting, there are, I suppose, the awareness of the need to be agile and think about the reality of organisational life. I mean, I think some organisations have got it quicker than others. That's what I would say. So there's still plenty of examples of rigid structures and so forth. But I think it's a great question. But I think both are true. Eleanor.
Yes, I mean, I would say that there's still some organisations that benefit from a sort of machine-like approach, like McDonald's or somewhere like that, where you could argue that their sort of standardisation and the regularity with which they work ensures that you get a really high, well, you could argue over quality, but a reasonable quality, a product to a certain quality standard every time. But I would say for most organisations, it is the expectations of change that people, well, I think expectations have changed. I also think conditions have changed. So as things have become more complex and more uncertain, it's required a different way of working. You can't necessarily, if you just keep working in a very standardized machine-like way, you miss out on opportunities. You can't respond that quickly enough or in an agile enough way. People get very stuck in a rut. That's one of the issues, or people work in a very siloed way. And again, part of resilience is, creating those collaborations, encouraging creativity, experimenting, so that you can ensure that you respond to the changes that are happening around you.
So a question that you've touched upon already, actually, Sue, with these innovations that you've been making, but we've had a question from Anonymous saying, how do you ensure that the teaching stays contemporary?
Yeah, well, I mean, all colleagues look at their material and are aware in their fields of new ideas and innovation. So in that sense, that's the duty of being paid as a faculty member. So that's one issue. I think the other thing is we are so lucky in this business school to be part of the wider university. And one of the things increasingly I find that really underpins some of the messages of leadership is to use somebody from a very different background. So, you know, getting somebody, John Lennox, for example, comes and talks. He's a mathematician and a philosopher. Comes and talks about what responsible leadership is. So I think, you know, in that sense, you know, we're keeping contemporary, not just by our own research, but actually by drawing on the wider university. And the other thing to say that some of the case studies I use still are pretty old, but you know what? The lessons in them are really rich. So, you know, it's not always the case that an old case study isn't valid. So I'll make that point. But so, you know, colleagues will think very deeply about the best way of getting their message across to you. And as I say, we review collectively the course every year and innovate in the margins and keep contemporary. So, you know, the whole COVID experience, you know, that's got to be part now of how we think about things. So that's how it works. Whoever asked the question, that's how it works.
I mean, I'd add to that just by saying that as faculty, you know, one of the things that motivates and excites us is having an ongoing program of research. Yeah. So alongside our teaching, we're all researchers, and we're all constantly researching new areas of practice. And I'm like continually researching resilience, and I build new ideas from my research into my teaching, often well before it actually gets published. So you're actually seeing the sort of latest thinking in a way in terms of where our research is at.
Yeah, and one of the things we did last module was bring in one of our doctoral students, our PhD students, who just had this really great idea. It was a shorter session, but I think people really appreciated the fact of hearing research on the move, as it were. You know, just an idea that, and I thought that was great. And that's, you know, that's one of the joys of Oxford. You know, and this kind of method allows us to experiment, as Eleanor says.
Great, thank you. There's been a couple of questions on delivery, which I'm going to come on to in a moment. Another question that's quite useful to get your opinion on is, do you think this programme would benefit someone who's thinking of setting up their own business? Yeah, we've had lots of participants who are in that position, anonymous. And you know, I think they found it incredibly helpful. I mean, going back to the differences and the variety, I mean, you've got variety of contexts, organisational, you've got variety of countries, and you've got variety of sort of leadership roles, of which, you know, setting up your own business or being an entrepreneur is one of that variety. And the course seems to really help all of them, really. So I would say yes. But, you know, the fact that we're enriching the community of practice by different kinds of leadership experiences is phenomenal. So the answer is big yes. Great. Thanks, Sue. So feel free to everybody to keep adding a few questions. Yeah. But I'm going to bring up the presentation, if that's possible, please, Sarah, and just tell you a little bit more about a few key bits of information that you might like to know. So as you can see here, it's and just to say actually that I did a dedicated session on the programme where I talk in quite a lot of detail about key details, so things like the class profile, the different modules, the delivery, and I had two members of the 2019 class join me and share a little bit of, on their insights and learnings of the programme. And that's available on YouTube, so it might be quite helpful to have a look at that as well. You can find quite a lot of information out there. But just to give you a bit of a summary of the programme, it's the diploma in organisational leadership is one of 5 diplomas offered by the business school, and it's a 1-year part-time programme. It's an accredited programme, so whilst it isn't a full degree, it is taught and assessed at master's level, so the same level as our executive MBA. And at the end, you'll come away with a postgraduate diploma from the University of Oxford. It is delivered in 4 taught modules over 12 months with study time in between at home. So it is sustained engagement, as you were saying, over a 1-year period. And we have 1 class every year. The next start date is February 2022, when we anticipate welcoming about 55 students from all over the world. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So here you can see a little bit more focus on the program structure and delivery. So as I mentioned, the setup, it's 4 modules. And in between the modules, we recommend that you commit about 5 to 8 hours of self-directed study time per week. So this is really flexible to you to fit in around your other commitments. As we mentioned, there are study groups and things that you will join, no doubt, with your fellow classmates, but it is designed to be manageable with all the other commitments that you have in your life. You'll spend that time in between modules preparing for the assessments and doing the pre-reading for each module. I saw that there were already a few questions on delivery, and naturally that's been a big question generally this year. So we are currently delivering the programme in a hybrid format. So that means that we have some students attending in person, and they're here in Oxford, and those who can't are joining online. And that gives people the flexibility to decide how they'd like to join module by module. I think looking forward to next year, it's likely that this will stay in place. We make a couple of important adjustments as a result of hybrid. So the main one is the module dates. So we extend those to 5 days, which means that we can spread out the content into slightly shorter days, and teaching generally takes place between about 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. UK time, just as a rule of thumb. But we run it over 5 days that will start on a Tuesday rather than a Wednesday. And that basically allows for breaks and hopefully for the different time zones of the class. As we mentioned, they're very global, so that tries to sort of help as many people as we possibly can. I'm now going to talk about the application process. Please, can I have the next slide? Thank you. So what we look for typically is that people have a good degree and a minimum of 5 years relevant professional experience. Most people have more than that, but we do ask for that as a minimum. So if you would like to go ahead and start an application, you can do that on our website. And what we need from you is we need an up-to-date CV. We need 2 references. We generally see people include professional references, but if you have studied recently, then it's fine, absolutely fine to include an academic reference. We need your transcripts for every degree that you have and that's listed on your CV. So that's the breakdown in marks and module from those awards, and we need those in English. And then there are 2 short essays, which are 500 words. The first is your motivations for studying the diploma, and the second is looking at your main achievements in your current position. Also to mention that you might have to submit evidence of your English language ability if English isn't your first language, but there are a number of exemptions for this. So for example, if you have recently studied in English, or you have a lot of work experience in English and are using English on a daily basis, you can apply for a waiver. You can find more information on our website, and by all means do get in contact with me, and I'm very happy to help and offer any assistance. So once everything is submitted and complete, we send your application for review, and we aim to get back to you pretty quickly. So ideally within about 2 to 3 weeks, you should hear from us. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the year is flying by, and I just wanted to mention some key deadlines that are coming up. Also to say that we do accept applications on a rolling basis, so you can apply at any time. You don't have to wait for these applications. But as you can see here, the next deadline is the 18th of October. That is worth noting. That's quite an important deadline because it's the final deadline for our scholarships. So we have the Women's and Directors Award scholarships, which are £10,000 towards the programme fee. If that's something that you'd like to be considered for, there is an extra part to the application process. So we ask you to upload a supporting statement as part of your application for the scholarships that you are interested in. Again, you can find a lot more information on our website about that and the criteria that we're using to judge. But feel free to get in contact with me again, and I'm happy to help. As you can see, the final deadline for the year is early December. I would say try to apply as early as you can. It is a popular programme. We've already received a good number of applications, but we will hopefully be keeping it open until later in the year. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. So for next steps, there's a few ways that you can interact or take things forward. By all means, request a meeting with me. You can see my contact details are here. I'll be very happy to answer any questions. You can also send me your CV to review. I'll be very happy to hear from you and talk about your background and eligibility and answer any further questions that you have. You can, of course, download a brochure as well from our website, or feel free to jump online and start an application. And as I said, the link is available on our website. Great. I'm just going to pause to see if there are any final questions. So there's a question actually before we finish. Are there any standout organisations that you think have shown great resilience during the pandemic period? Interesting question.
One for you, Eleanor, I think.
Yes, yeah. I mean, generally, overall, all the technology-based organisations have done incredibly well out of this. If you think about a lot of the retail organisations who had a strong online presence, ASOS, all those sorts of organisations, the sort of, and all those types of organisations that already were quite embedded in technology have done really well out of this. So again, it links back to really what I was saying about being anticipatory. The earlier you take advantage of opportunities like embedding technology in your business, the greater opportunities you can build on when you have that agility to be able to react to them. And obviously all other organizations like Netflix, Spotify, all those organizations are already very technology, their whole business platform was based around technology.
Great. And we've had a question from Stacey. Looking at organizations like communities, does the curriculum draw on the diverse interpretations of resilience and leadership generally?
Great point, Stacey. I think I should have said that earlier on. I mean, not only do we have a diverse community of students, which I think I have said how rich that is in terms of learning, but of course we do explore diversity more generally. In fact, one of the key learnings, I think, of the course is the need to appreciate that how you see the world is not how other people see the world, and that's a really important understanding. So I can assure you that that's absolutely in all the faculty's mind. But by the very nature of the way we've constructed the course and the community, that issue is consistently talked about and appreciated and learnt from.
Yes, I mean, I just thinking about that, I mean, one of our colleagues who teaches on the programme, Sally Maitlis, very much thinks about social resilience. So she very much thinks about how relationships are sort of the underpinning of resilience. So she brings that whole dimension about how leaders sense make and sense give, and what their role is in building communities. So yeah, it's an excellent question.
Yeah, very good.
I've had a question about the application process and how competitive it is. So a slightly tricky one to answer. I would say that your application is looked at holistically. So we look at a lot of different elements. We look at your academic achievements, your professional experience, and your career trajectory, your references, and obviously the essays that you put together. So as I said, in order to make you eligible, the main criteria are really is having a good educational background and some really solid experience and exposure to leadership and putting together a strong application. Great. A question about teaching. Is it focused on the private sector, or does it also consider non-profit?
It considers a variety of organisational contexts. I mean, my research background first off was healthcare. So, a lot of the examples that come to mind with me are from healthcare. Equally, other colleagues will have. So it's a mixture, it's a variety. And you'll find the cases also have a variety of different contexts. But of course, that's the whole point. You learn by exploring and being curious about other contexts that are not familiar to you. So that variety is crucial for the learning.
Absolutely. And a similar question for Justin, who I spoke with recently. So hopefully that answers it. But there will be people on the programme who work in the education sector and are leading schools and work for non-profit. So absolutely.
Yeah. And is it Michael? Michael talks about a really important point about the process of the trauma and the scars that that can incur when you've been laid off, and obviously that's been a feature of a number of organisations, a number of countries. So I think that's something that we talk about. We talk about compassionate leadership, and kindness in leadership in some senses. And I think the mental health dimension, challenges Eleanor, is very much part of that module as well. So Michael, I think you raised an important point, and it was remiss of me not to mention it, but of course, the impact of change on people, both positive and negative, and the impact on their own resilience is something that's actually crucial, not just for this module actually, but throughout. Okay.
Right. Thank you so much. And a big thank you to everybody for your questions, and some really insightful questions, and the chat's been really great as well. It's nice to start to replicate some of the learning environment here at the business school. So thank you so much to everybody for taking the time to join us today. The session is recorded, so you will receive the recording in the next few days. So by all means, I hope that's helpful to refer to. And a massive thank you, of course, to Sue and Eleanor for joining me today. It's been really great to have you on the session, and it's been really, lovely to see everybody.
Great pleasure, and I hope we can see some of you soon. That'd be
yes,
great.
We hope to see you not
Absolutely.
soon.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.